The blizzard wasn't just weather, it was a sentence carried out in real time. 6 wounded soldiers lay somewhere beyond the perimeter, bleeding into the snow as temperatures dropped and wind erased any chance of visibility. Command weighed risk against regulation, their voices clipped and distant, while transmissions from the field grew weaker. Static replaced words. Vitals dipped below safe thresholds, and the cold worked faster than rescue protocols could. In the hangar, Staff Sergeant Alyssa Hart watched the medevac helicopter through the frost. She wasn't on the duty roster, not even on standby, just a grounded pilot with no orders and no clearance. The decision wasn't hers to make, but as the last transmission faded into silence, it became clear no one else would act. Then the radio snapped on, cutting through the hush. The first distress call came in through a burst of static. A clipped voice, barely audible, pushed coordinates through the interference Alpha 2 patrol, stranded on the eastern slope of Blizzard Ridge. Ground control checked the satellite feed and saw 6 thermal signatures clustered together, their heat already dimming at the edges. The location was no surprise. The ridge's steep face, notorious for avalanches, and now a trap under the weight of the storm. The transmission cut out before the full request could come through. On the ground, the duty officer relayed the information up the chain. The answer returned almost immediately. Stand by. Risk assessment in progress. In the operations center, the meteorologist updated wind models, the numbers sliding further out of range for any safe flight. No one looked up. On the ridge, Corporal Jenkins worked with numb hands, wrapping gauze around Sergeant Ruiz's thigh. Blood seeped into the snow, refusing to clot. Private Cole fumbled with the flare gun, his gloves stiff with ice. Jenkins improvised a launch, but their attempt to signal dissolved in the window. One below saw the flare. The snow swallowed the red streak in seconds. Back at base, the communications tech adjusted his headset, straining to catch anything from Alpha 2. The signal was almost gone. The last transmitted vitals showed 2 men already sliding into early hypothermia, another's blood pressure dropping fast. The tech watched the satellite feed update, each refresh a little dimmer, the cluster of heat signatures shrinking. A printer rattled to life nearby, spitting out protocol checklists that kept stacking up, unread. The duty officer called command again, voice tight. Confirmed injuries, deteriorating conditions at the site. The answer was the same. Stand by. He watched the clock, each second marked by the silence on the emergency channel. On the ridge, Jenkins pressed a hand warmer against Ruiz's neck, but the medic's fingers had started to gray. Cole kept trying the radio, cycling through frequencies, but the only response was a single broken phrase, oxygen failing before the channel went dead. The base commander stepped into the operations center, studied the map, and asked for the latest weather update. Wind speeds up, visibility down to almost nothing. He nodded at the report and left as quietly as he'd entered. The duty officer gripped the phone, waiting for orders that never came. In the hangar, the pilot watched as one of the thermal signatures disappeared from the satellite display. The printer kept running, the wind outside howling against the doors. The emergency channel held its silence, while on the ridge, the cold pressed in closer, and the clock started to matter in a new way. The medic's reading showed 94.6 degrees score temperature, falling fast in air colder than -25. At 93, people start to lose consciousness. At 90, organs begin to fail. The reading was transmitted late, static, dragging everything behind real time. Command logged it, no comment. Sergeant Hale gave up his radio first. He stripped the coaxial cable, wound it tight around Corporal Chen's thigh, where shrapnel had torn through her snow pants. Blood soaked the insulation, then froze solid. The makeshift tourniquet worked too well. Chen's pain dulled as the cold numbed everything below the knee. Hale tried his backup radio. Nothing. Major Carson signed the operations log. Rescue deemed high risk pending weather improvement. The entry landed in the file, another line in a growing list. Upstairs, the meteorologist charted wind speeds, rising past 50 knots. He marked the update, but didn't call it in. On the ridge, Private Cole dug through drifted snow and found the emergency oxygen canister. The gauge hovered at 200 psi, barely enough for 6 people to share. Jenkins cracked the valve, rationing 2 breaths per person. The hiss of gas cut through the wind, then faded. Heat cameras at base refreshed every 90 seconds. 4 signatures stayed visible. 1 flickered, nearly blending into background cold before spiking back up. Someone moved, or tried to. The duty officer noted the anomaly, but didn't flag it for urgency. Ruiz stopped shivering. Jenkins forced him to sip melted snow mixed with the last glucose packet. The liquid froze at his chin before he could swallow. Hale checked Chen's pulse through his gloves thready, but still there. Cole kept adjusting the dead radio, cycling through channels, nothing but habit. Command held another review. 3 officers, 2 NCOs, no medics. The major asked for visibility first, injuries second. A lieutenant handed over the thermal printout. No one mentioned the 2 signatures already missing. Jenkins built a flare from the oxygen nozzle and a bootlace. It burned green and emergency, signal visible for less than 5 seconds before the wind erased it. The Western Watchtower caught a flash on night vision, but marked it as a sensor glitch. By the next camera refresh, Chen's vitals stopped transmitting. The monitor at base defaulted to dashes, continuing to log the last known numbers. Hale wrapped his parka tighter around her, the zipper frozen shut by blood. The duty officer called command again. No change in weather. Last transmission from Alpha 2 was unintelligible. He hung up, another protocol checklist printed and landed in the out tray, ignored. Cole found the morphine injector in Chen's vest. He handed it wordlessly to Ruiz, whose lips had gone blue. Jenkins took it, administered the dose, and let the empty injector vanish into the snow. The storm alarm sounded. Hangar crews secured equipment. The Pavehawk's rotors clicked as ice shifted across the blades. The pilot stood beside it, unnoticed. Chen stopped breathing. Hale checked with a scrap of foil, waited for condensation that never came. He said nothing. Jenkins was rewrapping Ruiz's hands with strips of thermal underwear, the fibers snapping as they froze. 3 heat signatures remained on the comms display. The duty officer flagged it for the overnight log. Cole whispered coordinates into the dead radio, repeating them until his voice blurred into the static. Inside the operations center, lines began to form, some officers drawn to the fading signals on the screen, others to the rules stacked in binders on the table. Inside the operations center, the atmosphere split along invisible lines. Junior officers clustered near the thermal display, eyes fixed on the screen, where 3 faint signatures pulsed and faded. Lieutenant Carson pressed his finger to the glass, tracking the shrinking cluster. Captain Wynne refreshed the satellite feed, ignoring the cold coffee pooling under his sleeve. Across the table, Colonel Whitford paged through the base regulations, thumb resting on a section about air rescue protocol. No attempts without confirmed visual on survivors. He didn't look up. His aide handed him a pen, and he underlined a line in the margins. A corporal slid the latest meteorology report toward Carson, but Carson didn't bother to read it. Instead, he slapped a printout onto the table 6 heat signatures, dim and scattered near the ridge's western face. One faded out as they watched, the cluster shrinking. Whitford's gaze stayed on the binder. "These are regulations," he said, voice flat. "They're not open to interpretation." No one answered. Outside the glass partition, the pilot watched from the walkway. Frost blurred the lower window, but she could see Carson's hands slicing the air above the table, frustration in every motion. Whitford's parka was still zipped, a barrier against the room's forced heat. The pilot's gloves creaked as her hands tightened, the scent of jet fuel soaking into the lining. Nguyen spoke up, voice strained. "Thermals still show live signatures, sir. That's enough for—" Whitford cut him off. "Live signatures aren't viable extractions, not in these winds." He tapped a page of handwritten calculations: fuel burn, crosswind drift, rotor stall speeds. "You want to lose another airframe?" The room fell silent. The tension pressed against the glass, heavy and unmoving. 3 levels below, a medic prepped plasma bags in the basement. counting 4 and setting them on the counter. The fridge hummed, louder than the wind outside. Protocol said to refrigerate until transport, but no one had called for transport. Carson replayed the last audio log labored breathing, metal scraping ice. Whitford dismissed it with a flick of his wrist. Equipment failure. Wind shear on the mic. Another captain entered, dropping a revised inventory list on the table. Whitford circled a line in red, his pen pausing when Carson's fist hit the table. The pilot outside saw the movement, a silent argument behind glass. Carson's voice dropped. 6 men up there. The heaters cycled on, swallowing the rest. Whitford finally looked at the thermal display, 2 signatures left, flickering. Outside, ground crew checked landing lights. The beams cut through the snow for seconds before someone shouted them off. The pilot turned from the window, the brief flash of blue-white light sliding across her face. Whitford initialed a form, passing it to logistics. When refreshed, the feed again signaled losses now across half the sector. Carson went quiet. The pilot started down the hangar stairs, boots echoing. She passed a NOAA printout taped to the wall, wind speeds nearly 60 knots, the paper flapping at the edges. Whitford stood, gathering his binder. His chair scraped the floor. "Conference room," he said, not looking back. "Bring your evidence." He left the operations center, Carson trailing behind with a folder under his arm, loose photos spilling out snapshots of old rescues, faces caught in snow and rotor wash. Down in the hangar, the Pavehawk's caution tags tore loose, spinning across the concrete. The pilot reached the bottom step as the storm alarm sounded again, 2 short bursts, 1 long. No one moved faster. Nguyen dropped into a chair, eyes on the last thermal image. 1 signature, flickering at the edge of the ridge, barely brighter than the static on the screen. The comms room filled with the hum of electronics and the waiting silence, everyone straining for a signal, for any word from the ridge. Static washed through the speakers, filling the comms room with a thin, grating noise that refused to settle. The specialist, headset pressed tight, worked the dials and filters, sifting for anything human beneath the interference. He was the last one still listening. The others had drifted out, called away by new orders, or simply retreating from the weight of the air. The pilot lingered in the back, half-shadowed, watching the green line pulse across the oscilloscope. Fragments broke through a voice, ragged and raw, choking out, "Arterial spray, West Ridge," before the line collapsed again. The comms specialist glanced at the medical chart taped to his console. Earlier, they'd logged femoral bleeding. The voice matched the urgency, the fear. He adjusted the frequency, trying to coax more from the static, but the next burst was only a whimper cut short. The room felt smaller, with each failed attempt. Command swept in, 2 majors in tow, their presence heavy and impatient. "Clear the room," the senior one said, not bothering to check the displays. Junior officers filed out. The pilot didn't. She stepped behind a filing cabinet, silent, eyes fixed on the console. The comms specialist didn't acknowledge her, just leaned closer to the speaker, his focus narrowing to the faintest patterns in the noise. A hiss broke the Paterna-strained rhythm of breathing, punctuated by a gasp and the metallic scrape of something dragged across ice. The specialist tuned out the senior major's muttered dismissal. Equipment failure. He knew better. He recognized the sound of someone trying to keep themselves alive. The pilot listened for details. The wet edge in each exhale, the shuffle of boots, the clipped breathing. She counted the seconds between each sound, mapping them to the reports from earlier. The hiss cut off, replaced by silence, and then, for a moment, a voice reciting numbers, 999, the cadence of a tourniquet being tightened, the count stopping at 12. Silence again. The major logged it as possible comms malfunction, pen scratching across the page, but the specialist left his hand on the tuner, unwilling to let go. The headset came off only when the signal was gone for good. The specialist powered down the receiver, the pilot unmoving. The majors left, one after the other, taking the logbook and leaving the room colder than before. The spectral display on the console showed nothing but a flat line. The pilot's eyes stayed on it, memorizing the shape of the last spike. She turned for the door, pausing at the threshold as the wind outside pressed against the frame. The specialist reset the receiver, volume just above a whisper, protocol demanding he wait for anything, a voice, a plea, or just the hum of the storm. Neither spoke. The pilot stepped out, boots silent on the linoleum, and the specialist's console beeped once as she disappeared into the corridor. Down the hall, the sound of footsteps faded, replaced by the shuffle of papers and the low voices of staff gathering for the next round of decisions. The hum of electronics lingered, a thin thread connecting the comms room to the rest of the base, even as the storm pressed in and the clock edged forward. Paperwork accumulated in silent stacks as the legal officer worked, each form lined up with the next, every page stamped and initialed. Waiver packets waited on the table, 7 pages each, mission parameters, liability, next of kin. The last page remained unsigned, blank above the line meant for a commanding officer's authorization. The legal officer tapped the edges, aligning the corners. Across the operations center, the corpsman read out pulse rates and blood pressures from the biometric feed. Alpha 2, 3 pulse 48. Alpha 2, 5 blood pressure 70 over palp. His voice was flat, repeating numbers into a room that had stopped listening. The medevac authorization form sat apart, a single sheet with empty checkboxes for weather minimums. The co-pilot's signature line was blank, a penciled note, Reynolds TDY Sol, beside it. The legal officer marked the form and moved it to the pending tray, where it covered half a coffee ring. The corpsman repeated the vitals, louder. The senior medic took the printout, clipped it to a board, and didn't look up. No one wrote the numbers down. In the medical bay, 4 plasma bags sat on the counter. The labels matched Alpha Team's blood types. The fridge cycled cold air through an empty compartment. A medic checked the wall clock and rotated the bags so the expiration dates faced out. Protocol required plasma to be refrigerated until just before use, but no one had ordered pre-warming. The bags stayed there, warming slowly to room temperature, untouched. Back in operations, the corpsman's monitor chimed. Alpha 2-1's EKG strip stretched out, the intervals between beats growing longer. He noted the time but didn't interrupt as the legal officer counted waiver copies. The printer jammed, spitting out half a biometric report before someone yanked out the paper tray, sighing. The corpsman called out, Alpha 2, 1 asystole. The senior medic looked up, then returned to inventory. The first soldier had died without rescue. The pilot's ready room was dark, the flight schedule for the week crooked on the wall. Reynolds was scratched out in the co-pilot column. The legal officer checked his forms, nodded, and initialed another line. In the medical bay, the fridge door swung shut. The plasma bags had reached transfusion temperature, but remained unused. The corpsman powered down his monitor. The last readout hung motionless, 3 lines flat, 1 jagged, 2 fading. 4 floors below, the pilot checked the Pavehawk's emergency medkit. 4 plasma tags matched the bags upstairs. Her fingers left frost on the plastic casing. A speaker above her crackled, announcing the shift change. No one mentioned the medevac stand-down. Bureaucracy moved at its own pace, grinding the team to a halt as casualties mounted. Forms waited for signatures. Protocols waited for clearance. The storm outside didn't wait. In the hallway, the pilot passed the medical bay and saw the plasma bags darkening as separation set in. She didn't stop. Her boots squeaked once on the tile, drowned out by the wind pushing against the windows. Upstairs, the corpsman watched his monitor flicker. Only 2 biometric feeds left, one erratic, the other barely registering. The legal officer locked his filing cabinet, the key sticking halfway out. Down the corridor, the senior medic noted the plasma had been at room temperature too long. Protocol said to use or dispose. He didn't check his watch again. As the legal officer filed the last unsigned waiver, the atmosphere in the operations center shifted. Decisions waited on weather, on numbers, on someone willing to move first. The storm's grip outside loosened in small increments, and those watching the radar began to notice. Inside the operations center, the debate circled without resolution. The meteorologist handed over the latest radar sweep. Visibility had improved, but only enough to show a faint outline of the ridge. The forecast suggested a brief window of marginal visibility, still below the threshold for safe flight. The duty officer hesitated, knowing the rules. Standard procedure called for confirmation from a second source before any action. The report sat on the table, red ink circling the numbers, but no one moved to sign off. Command argued in clipped phrases, voices overlapping with the corpsman's updates from the next room. Only one biometric signature remained. The ops chief pointed to the base regulational launch without 300 meters visibility. A junior lieutenant countered, citing commander's discretion for exceptional cases. The discussion stalled, neither side willing to take responsibility. Down the hall, the pilot reviewed her own set of calculations. 200 meters of visibility wasn't much, but she'd flown worse storms on previous deployments, trusting gut over graphs. She ran through the approach in her head, mapping the route by memory and instinct. Her gloves flexed as she gripped the edge of the table, eyes flicking between the weather printouts and the checklist she'd left open by the hangar door. A new weather report landed on the desk. Wind shear was climbing along the eastern face, the numbers ticking just above the recommended limit. The authorization folder moved to the pending tray, half hidden beneath a stack of updates. No one acknowledged it. The room grew quieter, each person waiting for someone else to act. In the hangar, the pilot checked the Pavehawk's status. The pre-flight checklist was still open, pencil resting on the line for hydraulic pressure. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling for ice, listening for the subtle shift of metal as the temperature changed. The helicopter was ready, or as ready as it would ever be. She closed her eyes for a moment, picturing the approach, the downdrafts, the whiteout. She trusted her instincts more than the numbers on the page. Command reconvened, citing updated wind protocols. The current readings were just above the cutoff. The colonel entered, silent, carrying the latest meteorology update. The decision was made without fanfare. No launch until visibility, and wind dropped below the limits. The announcement echoed through the intercom, short and final. The pilot stood by the helicopter, glancing at the unused authorization folder buried under weather reports. She removed a glove, pressed her palm to the cold metal, and checked her watch. Around her, the hangar lights buzzed, flickering once before settling. No one stopped her as she walked toward the flight office, where the spare ignition keys waited. In the background, the corpsman powered down the monitor, the last biometric feed gone. The comms officer adjusted his headset, static filling the empty channel. The meteorologist stared at the radar, watching for any sign of change. On the edge of the silence, something new began to filter through the noise. A final sound pushed through the static wet. Ragged breaths, spaced evenly apart, no words left. Metal scraped against ice in the background, a hollow, distant ping. The comms officer listened, headset pressed close, recognizing the last cry for help. It matched the earlier reports of blood loss, the kind that meant time had run out. The breaths grew slower, then faded. Silence settled over the room. The pilot stood in the doorway, her outline cast against the glow of the frequency display. The comms officer looked up. Their eyes met no words, just a shared understanding in the space between them. She didn't wait for orders or for protocol to catch up. She turned away, the choice already made. Command marked Alpha 2 as lost 18 minutes after first contact. The duty officer's voice was flat as he made the announcement, stamping the log sheet and filing it away. Down the hall, someone dialed down the speaker volume until the static was just a whisper, barely audible above the hum of the bass. The pilot moved past the operations desk. The meteorologist wiped away his earlier projections with a sleeve, leaving a smear where the numbers had been. The casualty forms were filed under pending. The next of kin section left blank. No one filled in the details. The process paused, waiting for something that wouldn't come. In the hangar, the Pavehawk sat with its fuel gauge at 3/4, enough for one attempt, no margin for error. The pilot traced the rotor blade's edge, scraping away a thin layer of ice. The metal underneath was dull and cold, catching the light from the emergency fixtures overhead. The comms officer appeared at the hangar door, a folded slip of paper in his hand. He set it on a tool chest and walked away without a word. When the pilot opened it, she found the last recorded coordinates from Alpha 2's beacon, the numbers written by hand, a decimal added for precision. The ink bled where her glove brushed melted snow against the page. A final weather update printed out, the wind speed circled in red. The duty officer filed it, ignoring the note about a possible break in the cloud layer. The printer jammed on the next sheet, paper crumpling in the tray. The pilot climbed into the cockpit, her gloves leaving damp streaks on the control yoke. Outside, a mechanic finished securing the auxiliary fuel cap, his boots scuffing the floor where a battery warmer had been kicked earlier. The base intercom called evening roll, the sound muffled by the walls. She flipped the power switches in sequence. Gauges flickered, none quite reaching the green. The comms officer watched from the window above, his headset set aside. The runway monitor changed to the east sector, the screen blank, except for blowing snow. Harness buckled. She tuned the radio to Alpha 2's old channel. Static filled her ears. Command's door stayed closed. The map on the wall still marked with 6 pushpins, only one matching the last thermal return. No one moved the others. The starter motor whined. The sound echoed through the hangar, ice cracking off the blades. The comms officer listened as the rotors began to turn, then powered down his station, leaving the screen on the last clear frequency. The printer's out-of-paper light blinked red. She checked her watch, then reached for the collective. The hangar doors rattled with the wind. She glanced once at the slip of paper in her hand, the coordinates smudged but still legible, then set it on the dash beside the checklist. She stepped out of the cockpit, boots striking the concrete as she headed for the far end of the hangar. The hangar felt colder as she moved along the Pavehawk's side, breath clouding in the air, boots echoing against concrete. Her hand brushed frost off the fuselage, the metal biting through her gloves. Blood from an earlier scrape mingled with the ice, but she pressed on, jaw set. Every movement was deliberate, each gesture stripped down to function. She worked through her own silent checklist, eyes scanning for anything that might slow her down. She passed the fuel gauges left, right, auxiliary etch reading short of full, but together just enough for a single run and little more. The de-icing panel glowed amber, warning that fluid was running low, well beneath minimum safety margins. She noted the risk, but didn't hesitate. The aircraft was short on de-icing fluid, and already operating beneath the lines drawn by regulation. The hydraulic pressure needle hovered above red, barely acceptable. She tapped the gauge, watching for any sign of movement, then moved on. Across the hangar, the mechanic watched from behind a line of tools, pretending to sort wrenches. He stopped when she began counting stretcher brackets, lips moving as she checked each clamp along the starboard side. He slid a battery warmer across the floor with his boot, letting it bump the landing gear. She picked it up and set it aside, her focus unbroken. She opened the medkit panel, checking plasma tags. Each one matched the blood types upstairs, the bags still untouched in the medical bay. She snapped the kit shut, eyes flicking to the hydraulic display. The numbers were tight, margin for error nearly gone. The wind battered the hangar doors, making the safety chains rattle and the overhead lights flicker. The mechanic moved to the breaker panel, flipping switches for minimal lighting, leaving the rest of the hangar in shadow. She climbed onto the stub wing, ignoring the pre-flight checklist fluttering from its hook. Instead, she pressed her forehead to the cold glass, staring through to the instrument panel. The artificial horizon was tilted, but she'd flown with worse. The mechanic coughed, tossing a small object her way. The spare ignition key landed at her feet, tag removed. He walked away without a word, whistling into the wind. She bypassed the co-pilot's signature, slipping the spare key into the ignition. Her hands didn't shake. The key turned with stiff resistance, but she forced it, urgency overriding protocol. She checked her watch, then the cockpit thermometer -31. Cold enough to freeze the lines, cold enough to keep the wounded alive if she made it in time. The mechanic reappeared, dragging a fuel hose toward the auxiliary truck, but didn't look her way as she crouched beside the main rotor, scraping ice from the links with her multi-tool. The ice broke off in sharp pieces, exposing the metal beneath. She stood, moved to the nose, and touched the call sign Echo 22, leaving a faint red mark. The mechanic paused, watching her pull the door shut behind her. Inside the cockpit, she powered up the system's navigation, instruments, overheating arch light flickering on in sequence. The wind outside climbed, the hangar doors rattling under the pressure. A caution tag finally broke loose, spinning to the floor. She glanced at it, then reached for the start sequence controls, listening to the storm build beyond the walls. She sat with her harness unbuckled, hands steady on the controls, waiting. The aircraft hummed around her, every system alive but idle. The hangar lights cast long shadows across the floor, the storm's howl pressing in. She watched the gauges, eyes on the numbers, every sense tuned to the threshold between risk and necessity. The moment stretched, suspended by the storm and the silence from command, as she waited for the last barrier to fall. Protocol and pulse rates never lined up. In the operations center, command reached a fragile consensus rescue, could proceed only if winds dropped below 40 knots. The colonel initialed the decision log, eyes on a forecast, not the real-time gusts spiking past 49. A lieutenant adjusted the radar's contrast, making the storm look thinner, the numbers easier to ignore. The weather feed scrolled by, the live readings edged out of sight. In the hangar, the pilot fastened her harness, pulling the straps tighter than any checklist required. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who'd memorized every step, but she left the official clipboard untouched. She knew the rules. No launch without clearance, no solo flight, no bypassing the co-pilot's signature. She also knew what was at stake: 6 lives already slipping away, the last biometric feed gone dark. Her actions weren't just a breach of regulation, they were a direct answer to the silence from command. The turbines spun up, the Pave Hawk's engine hum building beneath the storm's howl. Ice cracked free from the blades, scattering across the hangar floor. The pilot's focus narrowed to the instruments and the muted glow of her controls. She skipped the co-pilot checklist and set the trim by feel, not by the book. Every movement was a deliberate violation, each one measured against the clock running out for Alpha Team. Inside operations, the debate circled back on itself. The colonel's assistant delivered a fresh weather updater, 39 knots printed, 43 showing live. The paper vanished into a pocket. The official record stayed within limits. One entry in the logbook captured it all: weather acceptable for launch. No one looked at the actual anemometer as the winds rattled the windows and snapped a caution sign loose against the skids. The mechanic worked in the shadows, dragging a battery warmer closer to the fuel drums. He watched the rotors make their first full turn, then killed the hangar's emergency lights. Only the cockpit's pale glow remained, stretching shadows across the empty floor. No one in command noticed the sudden darkness on the security feed. The pilot adjusted her headset, tuning to Alpha's last known frequency. Static filled the channel, layered with faint, broken tones. She left the volume high, listening for any trace of a voice. Her gaze settled on the hydraulic pressure still below safe margin, but she didn't pause. Her hand steadied on the throttle, advancing it until the skids lifted, hovered, then settled again. Ice fragments pinged off the fuselage and scattered onto the concrete. Outside, the wind gauge needle shook, then snapped under a gust. No one recorded the final number. In the cockpit, the pilot's breath fogged the glass, her eyes on the checklist she'd already abandoned. The storm pressed against the hangar doors, rattling them in their tracks. She waited, the helicopter alive beneath her, every system straining at the edge of protocol. The next move would decide everything. Engines spun up before anyone in the tower cleared the frequency. She powered the Pave Hawk to life, without waiting for orders, skipping the co-pilot's checklist and tuning her radio to Alpha's last channel, a line no one else was monitoring. The headset filled with static, no weather alerts, just the low hum of defiance. Navigation lights flickered in the hangar gloom, blades turning slow at first, then faster, scattering ice and dust across the concrete. The mechanic paused behind the fuel drums, wrench in hand, as the rotors blurred the air. On the security cameras, the image jumped a glitch. Or maybe just snow on the lens but enough for command to see. The helicopter lifting, skids clearing the floor, movement where there should have been none. The colonel's shout for authorization raced down the line, but the engine's rising pitch swallowed his words. In the tower, the operator's hand hovered over the mic, waiting for a call that never came. No one stopped her. The chocks vanished, dragged clear by a single step as the aircraft hovered, then drifted left, pivoting toward the doors. The hangar doors stayed closed a moment longer than protocol allowed. When they finally slid open, the nose of the helicopter pushed into the storm, wind gauge needles swinging to 49 knots. The Pavehawk emerged into the white, anti-collision lights blinking in the snow, flying lower than ground effect regulations permitted. The tower operator watched, headset still on, as the helicopter vanished into the storm's edge, its lights swallowed by the drift. Inside command, the colonel pressed to the window, lips moving with orders no one could hear. The junior lieutenant adjusted the radar display, shifting the map to the ridge where Alpha's last signal had faded. No one filled out the launch log. The pilot banked right, feeling the tail shudder under crosswinds, blood from her knuckles mixing with frost on the collective. She ignored the GPS and inertial nav, relying instead on the pressure in her ears and the brief glimpses of terrain through the windshield. Ahead, the ridge was only a dark line in the snow, sometimes visible, sometimes not. Turbulence hit hard, the harness biting into her shoulders as the aircraft dropped. She corrected by instinct, hands steady on the controls. The storm flexed around her, ice feathering the glass, de-icing fluid nearly gone. She counted seconds between wind shear alerts, every one a reminder of what she risked. The radio crackled command's voice, ordering her back, but she didn't answer. Her focus stayed on the shifting outline ahead, the only thing that mattered now. Back at the hangar, the mechanic stood in the open doorway, snow swirling around his boots. He watched the empty space where the Pavehawk had been, then closed the doors, leaving streaks of hydraulic fluid across the panel. The runway lights flickered in the storm, snow piling in perfect circles where the skids had pressed down. On radar, the helicopter was just a blip moving toward the ridge. In the operations center, no one spoke. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of screens and the distant sound of wind pressing against the glass. No one gave the order, but the ground crew rolled out the emergency floodlights anyway. 6 portable lamps cut through the snow, their beams overlapping and reaching out toward the ridge. The switches clicked on, one after another, blue-white circles blooming on the tarmac. A sergeant nudged the last light a few degrees east, lining its beam with the only possible flight path. No one stopped him. Above the airfield, the storm pressed down, but the lights held steady, marking a corridor that didn't exist on any official chart. Inside the medical bay, the medics pre-warmed plasma and blood, ignoring the strict temperature protocols. The corpsman leaned against the counter, feeling the heat through the plastic, watching the second hand sweep the clock. He didn't flinch when the mechanic from Hangar 3 arrived, boots tracking meltwater. Without a word, the mechanic set down a stack of chemical warmers, the kind meant for field rations, not transfusions. The corpsman pocketed them and turned up the thermostat. The plasma bags waited, ready to move the second the call came. In the equipment locker, a sergeant laid out trauma kits on the prep table, each one checked and resealed. He lined them up by the exit, where Echo 22's ground crew usually parked. The corpsman from medical appeared, 4 warmed bags in hand. They nodded, silent, stacking the supplies together. The door stayed propped open, a draft curling around their boots. No one asked for a manifest. No one signed for the gear. On the apron, 2 ground crew members filled thermoses with coffee and loaded them onto a utility cart. The mess hall kept the line open past closing, ignoring the clock. The cart rattled across the tile, wheels squeaking as it made its way toward the eastern hangars. No one questioned why provisions were being sent out, or who would need them in a storm like this. In the tower, the operator kept his headset volume turned up, white noise and wind interference filling the channel. The logbook stayed open, pen untouched. He watched the floodlights illuminate the ridge and the gear stack up on the prep table below. No one asked for a launch code. No one called for a stand down. Instead, the actions folded together: lights, blood, supplies, coffee, each small defiance forming a silent pact. The ground crew, medics, and even the mess hall staff moved in quiet agreement, backing a mission that Command wouldn't authorize out loud. Command watched from behind glass as the floodlights burned through the snow. No one mentioned the missing paperwork or the unsigned forms. The radar showed a single blip moving toward the ridge, and the display stayed at double magnification, every eye following its path. The colonel's hand hovered over the comms handset, but he let it fall, saying nothing as the blip held position near Alpha's last known coordinates. Down in Hangar 3, the crew chief found only scattered ice and a caution tag pressed into the snow, its warning faded and unread. He left it there, switching off his flashlight as he stepped back inside. Outside, the runway lights cycled white, then red, then white again, repeating the pattern until dawn. No one spoke of what they saw, or what they did not see. The only record was the light on the snow, the warmth in the plasma, the readiness of the gear. In the quiet, every action became its own Unsera silent approval, waiting for the outcome no one dared put to paper. The corridor held, floodlights reaching out through the storm, and the base waited for what would come next. 6 soldiers returned from the ridge that night. The official log recorded Echo 22 airborne for 37 minutes, no clearance, no explanation. The investigation never closed, with answers just a gap in the records, and a flight path that didn't match any regulation. Months later, a handwritten note appeared above the pilot stations. Minimum safe visibility is what you make it. The paper yellowed, but no one took it down. New crews treated it like policy, a quiet shift in the way things worked. If you believe decisive action matters more than protocol, take a moment to subscribe and share your thoughts below. Stories like this remind us what's at stake when hesitation wins.